I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to ThinkRadio.
The first musical that makes an impression on me was I went and saw the all-black version of Hello, Dolly, and Pearl Bailey and Cab Calloway played the leads in that. And they said, "You've been such an appreciative audience that we're going to do a set for you." And they did their cabaret stuff for another half hour.
Oh, wow. That's Dr. Paul Edwards, lifelong professor and student of theater and story. It's a great conversation about the value of both in any healthy society. Stay tuned for this and much more on this episode of ThinkRadio.
ThinkRadio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a ThinkRadio supporter, visit kbut.org.
Paul, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for asking me.
You know, I was thinking about your career, newly retired or semi-retired or whatever.
Easing out.
Okay,
yes.
I like that. And trying to sort of wrap my head around what it means. And one of the first questions that came to mind is, how many shows have you directed in your career?
In my career, I was trying to go over that, and I think it's getting up close to the centennial number. It's
Really?
getting up to close to 100 productions when if you count, and I count everything. It's easily getting close to 100 productions.
So is that a goal you have?
Do
You
you
want
mean
to hit that 100 mark?
Oh, I want to keep going after I hit that 100 mark. Yeah, that's just a marker that says, wow, okay, you've done this a lot.
Well, because having some experience directing shows myself, what I really thought was, okay, that doesn't actually tell the whole story.
Right.
How many hours does that represent in pre-production and rehearsals?
I think this is a misconception that people have, is like you have a certain level and you put in X number of hours. But as you and I both know, you put in about a baseline of 60 to 80 hours, no matter what.
Sure, and that's why you said whether it's a children's theater production.
That's why I don't make the distinction.
Right.
Yeah. Now, if you do a musical, as you know, the 60 to 80 is not even close. And I don't think people realize that. And they're like, do you really spend that much time?
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, yes.
Yes, you do.
Yes, you do.
Because honestly, you're not just a director.
Mm-hmm.
You're also a stage manager.
Mm-hmm.
You're a prop builder. You're a costume. Yeah,
I'm not a costume person,
but you approve the costumes. I mean,
you still have to go through. You have to talk with the costume designer. You have to talk with the set designer, and I don't think people realize that there's all this negotiation that goes on.
Yeah.
And then once in a while, you get lucky, and you get a September Sack, who's your stage manager. Then some of those hours.
Yeah, lucky doesn't quite cover it.
Exactly.
But the point is, people experience theater, especially at the local level, without really understanding what goes into it, because the actors are putting in a lot of hours too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think that's what's very healthy about the Son of a Gun, is that people who would never go near theater do Son of a Gun, and they get a little bit of an idea of, oh, wow, this is not what, don't you think? I mean, I think that a lot of people get in there the first time at the Son of a Gun and are surprised at what a commitment it is for the performers. And I'm not putting down the Son of a Gun, but that's a fun thing. I mean, largely the focus is on having a good time, which that's what it should be.
And it's a good thing, because after all that time spent, people still come back year after year to do the Son of a Gun.
It's terrific. Yeah, you've got the hardcore, and that's the only thing in the way of performing that they'll do. And that becomes their thing for the year, and that's great. And it's healthy. I mean, we all laugh about the Son of a Gun, those of us that have been around it and involved with it. But boy, what a service it performs to the community.
Well, it sounds like you have no intention of stepping away from theater, even though you're easing out the university. But right now, I'd like to go back and pick up the beginning of the story. Your origin story. How did you get to be Paul Edwards, making this choice for this career?
So anytime on any of those personality tests, I'm an extreme introvert. And I thought that was odd until I found out that most theater people are introverts. So I had to teach myself to be an extrovert. But what I had is a natural tendency to act out. So I can remember when I was 4 years old, I was at home with my mom, who at that time was a stay-at-home mom, and I would enact the fairy tales. I'd find costumes and put them on, and I would perform. Now, where did that come from?
born with it.
Apparently, because nobody said to me, hey, go out and try doing this. I just automatically put costume pieces on, and I would perform these for my mother while she worked in the kitchen.
Oh, I would really love for there to be some like 8mm footage.
There's there is some 8mm footage of me in the 6th grade dental health play, but you can't see me very well because I play a head of cabbage. And that was my first acting role. My parents were both they loved musicals, and we lived about 100 miles away from New York City. So once or twice a year, we'd go down to New York and see a Broadway show. And I started to go along on that when I was about 8 years old.
What's the first musical you ever saw?
Well, that's a good question. The first musical that makes an impression on me, let me put it that way, was I went and saw the all-black version of Hello, Dolly, and Pearl Bailey and Cab Calloway played the leads in that. And they did the show, got a standing ovation, and then they said, you've been such an appreciative audience that we're going to do a set for you. And they did their cabaret stuff for another half hour.
Oh, wow.
And then, it's a back and forth where you go through the usual thing. Well, is this something that you can make a career in? Is this something that you really want to do your whole life? And I just happened to find the path to get in and, do it my whole life and do it in a way that worked really well for me. I think.
Because that is a question. I can imagine young people all over the country saying to their parents, I want to go into theater. And their parents' hearts sink.
Yes.
Because it is a tough thing to make a living at.
They want to go into theater, or they want to go into film, or there's all these things that look quite glamorous, but the road to self-sufficiency in those fields, is a steep path.
Which brings us to really what motivates people like you and other artists. What is it?
It's you can't imagine that not being a part of your life. You can't imagine a world where you would stop doing that. And as you know, we drag our kids into that. We drag our spouses into that.
It becomes a family affair.
It really does. And they remember that the same way that, other kids might remember camping trip or, even though one of my kids is not doing anything remotely associated with acting anymore, she still is a member of an improv troupe up in Anchorage. It becomes a part of your life, and you think, I really can't walk away from this.
Yeah. And so you've taught a lot of these people over the years, people who come through and they're passionate about this.
Right.
What do you tell them about the realities of the path they've chosen?
I always believe, first of all, being honest with them and saying, I made some mistakes early in my career, not terrible mistakes, but mistakes I wish I could go back and fix, where I knew somebody really wanted to do it, but I had a suspicion that they didn't understand what it was going to take for that particular person to do it. And I didn't tell them because I was afraid I'd hurt their feelings.
Right.
And then I had a discussion one time with a student who came back and said, and I said, well, I kind of saw tendencies of that. And this person said, why didn't you tell me? And I was like, well, I was afraid you hurt your feelings. She said, well, how did you think I felt, when it didn't work out?
Well, that's a good point.
And that was an important life lesson.
Yeah.
And so I never did that again.
So when you have to tell somebody, this might not be for you.
Yeah, it takes a long time to get to that exact statement, but more questions. As a teacher, I've realized that you teach more by asking questions than by making statements.
Well, yeah.
And so I'll say to them, so where are you thinking of going with this? What do you think your limitations might be?
Yeah.
And start to get them to ask those questions of themselves.
Well, that's good advice for listeners at home considering quitting their day job and moving to LA.
Yes. There are an awful lot of people fresh out of high school or college that do that. They move to New York City or they move to LA. I think it's a good life lesson for them to do that. But after about 5 or 6 years, there's this issue of living in New York or living in LA. And the overwhelming majority, and this is as it should be, I think, the overwhelming majority go, I'm going to do this thing, but in a different place. I didn't have that issue. I sort of flirted for a long time with living in New York, but I was also really familiar with New York City and just didn't think I had it in me to do that. And so this actually was perfect. And people say, well, were you setting the bar too low for yourself by locating in a place like Gunnison? Or have you ever had regrets? And the answer to both is no.
Well, why not?
Well, in the time since I moved here, it feels like this whole valley has really been marching forward. I mean, we've had our high points and our low points, but the progress has been forward-thinking and in a way that I think makes this valley really distinctive, because we've resisted some of the more stereotypical ways of getting to the next place. And so it's exciting to work in the arts in a place like that. It also gave me an opportunity to do something else that was a huge priority, which was to be a member of a family, to have kids. And so I couldn't think of a better place to raise 2 kids, frankly. And I don't think the bar is set low, because the bar is high no matter where you perform.
That is a fact. If it's not, you're doing it wrong.
Exactly.
On the subject of making art in a small community, there seems to be this misconception. I run into it in my own thinking. I run into it in others, that if you're not making art in a place like New York or LA, that somehow it doesn't count.
That's right.
Somehow it's, if you haven't been in Billboard magazine, then you're not doing it right.
That's right.
What is your answer to that?
I always think of a guy by the name of Bob Stewart, who was the parent of a college buddy of mine, and he was one of the guiding spirits of this large community theater group in Concord, New Hampshire. And Bob Stewart, he was an accountant, but he gave his entire life to that job of helping to steer that community theater company. And it had affected the lives of so many people. Or I think about my own brother Mike, who was the drama coach at a girls' high school. This is post-retirement. He had another career and then decided to get a teaching degree and teach for another 10, 15 years. And he's got 2 people that have appeared on Broadway that are his students, and one of whom every opportunity gives him credit for being one of the people that most shaped him. And so I think, it's organic in a lot of ways, isn't it? It's like the water problems on the West Coast have as much to do with the headwaters up here as they do with what's going on the coast.
Because whether you're there making art or whether you're here making art, the kind of art that we're making collectively today is shaped.
Yes. And you're also shaping audiences, too. So you have a lot of people in the Gunnison Valley that'll go to the Denver Center, or they'll go to New York, or they'll go to LA, and they're savvy about theater because there's theater here.
Because they've had an opportunity to do it. That is one benefit of making art in a local community. You get an opportunity. You show up for an audition, you're not competing against 500 other people.
Yeah. There's another story that's worth telling, too, and that's, you know who Jeff Daniels is.
Yeah.
He's like an artistic director of a small theater company.
Somewhere like Minneapolis or somewhere.
Well, it's even outside of Minneapolis. I mean, it's in a suburb or whatever, but he understands that. He goes back and does live theater, has his hand in live theater in a smaller market.
And look, if you're one of those people that you've described, you can't imagine not doing it. Then
that's right.
The opportunity to just do it, to be on stage is a marvelous thing.
Exactly.
Broaden our vision just a minute and talk about theater at the philosophical level. Theater as, capital letters, art form. There are a lot of people who pontificate that theater is a dying art. And I think what they're talking about is just sheer numbers of people who shell out for a theater ticket.
Right. You can't really compare it to film, because I think film is a more pervasive art form right now. But you certainly can compare live theater to professional sports. And there's all sorts of studies out there that show that there's people forking out money for theater tickets just as much as there are for professional sports. And it's actually doing quite well. Think of the thousands of people, just to pick one very tiny sliver of theater in America, how many go to the Buell Theater to see the road company of a Broadway show?
Oh, it's packed.
They sell out.
Multiple shows.
Yes. And then think again how many people, and think about it in terms of per capita, think how many people go to theatrical productions here in this valley. Now, we would like more to come. We'd like to build that audience base, and I think there's work to be done there, and I think everybody involved in theater in the Gunnison Valley would agree.
Well, it's a loyal audience for sure.
And that's for sure, too.
There are people who show up time after time.
There's actually more theater going on now in the United States than at any other time in the country's history.
Really?
Yes, because the regional theaters have done that. You didn't have these resident companies in every single moderate-sized city in the United States, and you do have that now.
And what has made the difference? Why is it that those are working now where they didn't before?
That's a good question. I think a certain amount of it is that some communities have embraced the value of live theater and are willing to subsidize it in some way. I think we've gotten away from theater being what those people do over there, although there still is a certain amount of that attitude. I think we're working more towards
becoming more mainstream.
Yeah. Come on, just all you have to do is walk on stage and say these two lines. Come on, and so I think we've become more persuasive on getting people involved. And I think that the more that theater roots itself to community in some way, the Globe Theater in England was a community theater. People forget that. And they go, oh, well, come on, it's not quite the same thing. And it's exactly the same thing. Shakespeare wasn't writing for an international audience.
No.
He was writing for the people that came to that particular theater. He was also writing for the royal family too, but he was very much grounded in the popular theater, and those are people that could pay a penny to go in. So.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because you hear people say the words community theater, and there's almost a sneer in their voice. They almost are saying, community theater to them seems synonymous with lack of quality, but that is absolutely not true.
Well, and certain people in the theater self-perpetuate that, and we've got to watch ourselves on that of going, oh, this is just something I'm doing for this theater company. The minute you get that mindset, you've got to have a sit-down with yourself.
Well, you've pointed out that I have done a fair amount of directing, and a lot of it was at the high school level.
Right.
And I would always begin every production with a little circling of the wagons, and I would make the statement, I don't do amateur theater. And so I expect that you will not show up here prepared to provide an amateur performance either. Mm-hmm. And their eyes would always get wide. I would tell them how we achieve that is a lot of hard work.
Right.
But there's another aspect of the word community that I want to touch on, because that's not just about the people who are involved, but that's also about the role that theater plays in community. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that and why it's so valuable.
This has become a huge thing with me, just coincidentally, to the extent of this was at least something that played a factor in my decision to retire now, while I was still young enough and could still have like a second act. But it's looking at theater and performance as a way of knowing. I firmly believe that the arts are an essential part of how human beings see the world, and people who do not have art in their lives are sort of blinkered, because it's one way of seeing the world that is not available to them because they've never taken any interest in it. Mm-hmm. I happen to believe that everybody has an interest in art. They just don't want to admit it.
Well, everyone is consuming art in some way or another. Right?
Absolutely. There's some very significant research that's been done recently that we should be paying closer attention to about the impact of the arts in human ability to see the world and to function in the world successfully.
Well, that's interesting. I've been doing a lot of thinking myself recently about story.
Yes.
At the philosophical level, and how story is really not a thing in and of itself that we can separate and set over there. Story is how we process information, including what kind of culture we are, what kind of society we are.
There's a terrific book. It's called The Storytelling Animal, and he goes into that, about that's one of the distinguishing characteristics of our species is our ability to formulate narratives. Mm-hmm. And then you had an Italian guy by the name of Umberto Eco, and he talks about what's also doubly unique about people is their ability to formulate stories about things that never happened, that they can actually create a world and create very sophisticated narratives. And if people say, really? Well, Lord of the Rings is a perfect example of that.
Star Wars.
Star Wars.
Yes, and back to your point about that being a way of knowing, it's a way to deal with complex and maybe even controversial issues without pointing fingers. If I create a character...
That's the sacred space.
If I create Luke Skywalker and we follow his arc through his life, then I can deal with issues in his life that I'm really talking about mine or my society.
Yeah, it's interesting how different cultures have come to that understanding of the arts. You set aside a space, you tell a story in there. If you told that story somewhere else, you'd be thrown in jail. But if you
or run out of town.
Or run out of town. If you tell it on the stage, you're protected. And the culture somehow knows, okay, this is a way for us to tell a story, try it out, see how it works.
There was a time when we did that more explicitly than we do now. Would you agree with that statement? That it was people involved in theater were more politically explicit about their intentions. I'm thinking of street theater, for instance. I'm thinking of some of the real activist plays that have been produced, and everyone involved knew that that's what was going on.
These are terrible questions to ask somebody like me who's practically involved in the theater and then academically involved in this, because my brain goes crazy at this point. I would offer two things. I don't mean these to be the only two possible explanations, but just two things that occur to me. In Western civilization, we have become increasingly interested in our own selves, which works against a theater of the politic. So, for example, you have increasingly stories like Death of a Salesman, which looks at the psychology of a particular salesman. And I would say even there you still have the politics of Arthur Miller is pervasive in that. But I think that it's grown increasingly personal. And so when you have an audience that is thinking of things in terms of themselves as individual, that's not bad, but if it becomes almost exclusively individual, you're going to have less of an audience interest in the big political picture. But think about it for a moment. Look at the traction of Angels in America. What could be more political than that? And it just had a huge revival, and, it's, 20 years or 30 years? I don't want to think too hard about that, because I remember when that first came out. But who would have thought that something like that would have had the traction that it does?
Well, it played the role that you're talking about. It took a complex and controversial issue, in this case, AIDS,
and religion,
sexual identity, and religion,
the whole business,
and put it in a package that we could consume without being consumed by it.
And it had the personal there, but it was also very political. This is the big thing. This is the second thing I wanted to say. Sometimes political theater became too polemical. Then you only have this wide of an audience.
Sure, it's an echo chamber.
And a lot of people are dealing with that right now on all sides of the political spectrum, is only bleeding out one way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot about story recently, and I've been invited a couple of times to share those thoughts. And one of the things that I do share with people, particularly in context of our modern politics, is that we really need to stop thinking of our story in terms of an antagonist and a protagonist. That it's more helpful to think about oppositely charged protagonists.
There you go. This is a major misunderstanding about Greek tragedy. The antagonist is not the bad guy. The protagonist was the person who had a dilemma. The antagonist was the person who already had his or her mind made up. And that's what made them so difficult, is that they already knew what they were doing. And if you look at this, perfect example is Antigone. People think Antigone is the tragic hero. She's not. She's the antagonist. And Creon is the one who's the protagonist in that play, strangely enough, because he's the one on the horns of a dilemma. Antigone knows what she's going to do right from the very beginning, and she does it, and she pays her price for it. And so the antagonist in a lot of Greek tragedy is actually someone, they know what their feelings are. The protagonist is the one that has conflict.
Oh, that's fascinating. So in terms of the ability of the citizenry to navigate difficult political times, these are very useful concepts. Knowing something about theater, understanding story.
Absolutely. So what's really interesting is that Aristotle in the Poetics says that dramatic poetry is an imitation of an action, that a tragedy is an imitation of an action. Well, what's it imitating? It's imitating real life.
Sure. It doesn't have anything else to imitate.
Exactly. Yes. And I often, when I teach script writing, I often say that to the undergraduates, that I don't want to see plays about aliens and animals and little kids, because in every case you're using them as substitutes for adult humans. So let's just focus for now on how actual adult human beings interact. And then you can go back to the aliens and the animals. And
in order to do that, you've got to pay attention.
And it's hard to do that when you're always looking at your phone and you always have your earbuds in listening to the music that you have programmed.
Oh, well, that's a whole nother conversation right there.
But it's important to theater, because when the people with the earbuds in and the screen in front of them go to live theater, they go, wow, what the heck is this? And I think there's an audience there that takes them out of that world of the controllable digital universe.
If nothing else, that is providing a contrast.
Yes.
That then might actually have the effect of leading people back to live performance.
Exactly.
We've talked about the state of theater and its history, and with a history as deep as story, it's hard to contemplate innovations. But do you see innovations in the theatrical landscape these days, things that kind of pique your interest or excite you, think, oh, I'd love to explore that?
I think probably one of the most innovative pieces of theater that's come out in recent years, I know it sounds like I'm just jumping on the bandwagon, but I think with good reason, is Hamilton, which fundamentally changed how a musical is produced and deals with the issue of, if this is going to be a story for the whole culture, then the whole culture needs to be involved in the telling of that story, as opposed to one sliver of the culture telling the story to everybody else. That's significant.
Well, Paul, what's next for you?
Okay, this sounds terrible, but for 31 years I was a professor, and there's certain things you have to do as a professor. I don't have to do them now.
We're talking about committees.
And even things that I desperately enjoyed doing, like preparing curricula. And doing it within the context of a larger organization, I kind of want to be what they refer to now as an independent scholar and artist. That's my umbrella term.
Well, as an independent scholar and artist, what can we expect to see? What are you interested in?
I'm interested in just what you were talking about with your prior question of what's new, what's different. I think it's remarkable, for example, that the Center for the Arts is looking into ways to develop a dedicated space for aerial ballet, for example, which now gives people who didn't have the ability to express themselves through dance an ability to do that. That's the kind of things that need to be happening. And not always jumping to, oh, that costs too much money, or, oh, that's such a tiny audience, or, oh, this, or, oh, that. But, well, how could we do that?
Right.
And how can we do that in a way that's beneficial? Here's an important thing. How can we do it in a way that's beneficial to the overall community?
Well, we're back to that word.
Yes.
Which, to me, is the guiding word for lots of things, but particularly where the arts are concerned.
Yes, I would agree.
Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Thanks. This was wonderful. Thank you.
ThinkRadio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. To contact Alan, visit alanwardismedia.com.
The show's producer is Issa Forrest. Original music by Issa Forrest. Thanks for listening. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio.